Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 82nd episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And on today's episode, I'm going to be wrapping up our March month of showcasing female entrepreneurs by talking about agency and the positive experience I have had running my own business. Over the last year, things haven't been plain sailing, of course. However, I do feel being a female solopreneur has enabled me to weather the storm a lot better. So first of all, I want to define what do I mean by the term agency. I'm going to be using the term agency in terms of sociology and psychology. So I'm using the definition, first of all, from Zimmerman and Cleary in 2006, who say personal agency can be defined as the ability to initiate and direct actions toward the achievement of defined goals. The sense of agency is essential for you to, or for one to feel in control of their life, to believe in the capacity to influence our own thoughts and behavior, and have faith in our own ability to handle a wide range of tasks or situations. For me, this is essential as I didn't have much control over things growing up, and it's particularly important to me now. When running a small business, it's about making those daily decisions that I think are best to move things forward. And I don't feel confined by unhelpful work policies and procedures. I feel that I can circumnavigate things and be as agile as possible. And that really is agency in action for me. Whilst running a business of any size may not be right for everyone, and yes, of course, things are financially precarious. So I'm not saying that this is the solution for everyone. I'm not saying you should do anything that feels uncomfortable or that puts you in a difficult situation. But I also don't feel that that should stop anyone from thinking about this. So whether you take action is another thing, whether you think actually running a business isn't for me, that's absolutely fine. But I think it's essential to consider this and consider the role agency plays and work out a way to make it work for you. And often when I coach my coachees, they feel stuck, bored, frustrated, and not stretched enough to make things work in the right way for them, or not stretched in the right way. So they might feel very stretched in terms of admin burden, work admin, home admin, taking on a lot of the psychological strain, but they're not having agency in the way that they want to. And it's also vital to acknowledge that the experiences of women of color at work are specific. It's being talked about more, but it is different to white majority, to the things that white majority might experience or not experience indeed. So being subtly silenced, I think many global majority women, we've experienced that, not being included in meetings, in social events because of assumptions being made, being asked personal questions about our home life and hair that no one else gets asked who isn't from a global majority group. Your written work may be red penned to the nth degree when it's correct. It's just a matter of subjectivity, being deliberately kept down and given too much work because you are indispensable, and the list goes on. And in a recent Harvard Business Review article entitled "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome," and I just want to add on a hallelujah there because I have a lot to say about this. This article is by Rushika Tulshian and Jodie Ann Burry, and they talk about the fact that for women of color, the self-doubt and feeling that we don't belong in corporate workplaces can be even more pronounced. Not because women of color, and they cite in brackets a broad, imprecise categorization, have an innate deficiency, but because the intersection of our race and gender often places us in precarious position at work. Many of us across the world are implicitly, if not explicitly, told we don't belong in white and male-dominated workplaces. And they make reference to half of the women of color surveyed by Working Mother Media, which is in the US, plan to leave their jobs in the next 2 years, citing feelings of marginalization or disillusionment, which is consistent with their experiences as well. Exclusion that exacerbated self-doubt was a key reason for each of the transitions of their transitions from the corporate workplaces to entrepreneurship. And so this is interesting. I don't feel I have imposter syndrome. I don't doubt myself in the sense that, I'm going to be found out soon. What I do have is what I call frustration syndrome. And what do I mean by this? For me, frustration syndrome is that I know, especially when I was trapped or I'd see these really senior level jobs and think, I know I could do the job, but I know that if I apply, I won't get an interview. Or I know that if I have applied, I never used to get interviews. And for me, frustration syndrome was really about how do I get there? I know the modes, I know the ways, but what about the how? I feel really frustrated. I see people that I don't think are particularly better than me or particularly smart getting these jobs, and I don't know how to do it. And imposter syndrome is loosely defined as doubting your abilities and feeling like a fraud. And it's seen that it disproportionately affects high achieving people who find it difficult to accept their accomplishments. And many have this sense of, oh my goodness, I better keep looking behind my back because I'm going to get found out. And the original concept was actually called imposter phenomenon by psychologists Pauline Rose Clance and Susan Imes in 1978. But of course, there are going to be times where we doubt or we think, am I doing the right thing? And that's just human nature. But is always labeling these things imposter syndrome helpful? And I just find it a very irritating and unhelpful term. And for me, again, I'm not saying that I get it right every single time. I am not saying I don't doubt myself, but do I feel that I'm where I should be? Yes. Do I feel that I have autonomy over a majority of my decisions? Yes. Do I feel I have to answer to anyone? Now, of course, I have to do a good job for you if you come to me, if you want to work with me as podcast listeners. But that for me is a different kind of accountability. If you're enjoying this content and want to keep up to date, then why not join my bi-monthly newsletter? You'll find a link in the show notes. It's packed every fortnight with top ideas, tips, things you can do in your workplace, and articles to read. And I'd love you to be part of that community. So you might be thinking, well, you've mentioned all these things, and particularly if you're a global majority Black woman of color, well, what can we actually do? And I wanted to just go back to this point about agency and the fact that it's actually deeper and more complex than we might think. So in 2011, there was a paper written by Reeve and Seng that talked about identifying 4 domains of engagement that influence motivation and behavior. Now, this was done in the classroom. So it was looking at school pupils in the US. But I thought the tenets that they've come up with were really, really useful to think about in terms of female entrepreneurship. Or if you think, oh, I don't really want to be an entrepreneur, there's also something called an intrapreneur. And I remember someone saying this to me. So an intrapreneur is someone that works in an organization, but they have an entrepreneurial mindset to push forward their area, the department, for the actual organization. So this could be for you if you're an entrepreneur, a budding entrepreneur, thinking about entrepreneurship, or you're happy being an intrapreneur, or potentially just thinking about you don't want to change anything. I think that this is a really helpful model. So it starts with behavioral engagement. So behavioral engagement is about focusing on the task, having attention and concentration, that there's high effort and there's high task persistence. So even if things don't work out at the first time, that you still persist. And you could actually link this with the concept of flow. So those of you that know the work that I often cite, the PERMA model, Martin Seligman, Happiness, Psychology of Happiness, they talk about flow being in a really deep state of absorption and not really noticing how the time is passing. And the second area is emotional engagement. So this is presence of task facilitating emotions, things like interest, enthusiasm, curiosity, asking questions. So when we start our entrepreneurship journey, our entrepreneurial journey, there are of course things that we feel really stuck on. I had no idea about marketing. And I remember when I went on an accelerator course called the Fab Accelerator in Oxford, and I felt so stretched in a great way. It was with a group of people who had different businesses. We were positively giving each other critique and feedback. Every week, someone would have to do a different presentation on different areas, things like, total accessible market, how to do finances, things I'd never, ever thought about. But it was very, very enlightening, and I felt very stretched. And also within emotional engagement, there's an absence of task withdrawal emotions. So things like distress, anger, frustration, anxiety, and fear are felt less. So when we're in that state of flow, when we're emotionally engaged, we feel those positive things. That doesn't mean things are easy, but we feel the absence of those task withdrawal emotions. We want to work out a way. We'll find a free webinar. We'll find someone that can answer our question. We'll put messages out there on LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. And the fact there's a community in a very different way in the entrepreneurial space. The third area is cognitive engagement. So this is the use of sophisticated, deep, and personalized learning strategies. Now, I did mention this paper was around classroom pupil learning, but if we think again around learning strategies about how to do our jobs, transitioning into the entrepreneurial space, making our businesses bigger, this is how we want to do that. So what are our personalized learning strategies to do that? And going back to that deep learning, not being afraid to take risks, not being afraid to fail. And we know what fail means, don't we, podcast listeners? First attempt in learning. You know, I love that cheesy acronym. And being able to also have an element of self-efficacy in terms of self-belief. The second area in cognitive engagement is seeking conceptual understanding rather than surface knowledge. So it's not just, the example I'll share with you is the word networking, which can be very triggering for a lot of people. People hate networking. Some of you maybe are enjoying it more during this time that we've had over the pandemic. Now, why do people really hate networking, or why does that word bring out these images? Is because people often say they have a vision of a very slick, and it's often male, person with lots of business cards, throwing them out almost like boomerangs or a frisbee to people, like, hey, here's my business card, and throwing them out to lots of people. And so for me, that's around the surface activities or the surface knowledge. Like if I do this, my knowledge is if I go to a networking event, I just talk at people, give out my business cards, that's networking. But really, networking is that, for me, if we use this seeking conceptual understanding, is the reciprocity. It's a two-way street. Yes, I do need some help, but this is what I can also offer. I'm building a connection, I'm building a relationship. So that cognitive engagement. So that's an example around networking. But of course, there are umpteen examples. It's not just that surface knowledge. And that's often what I see when I talk about frustration syndrome, that people who I feel have surface knowledge get to skyrocket, or they did in the workplace, whereas those with deeper conceptual understanding were often overlooked, but then were gone, that people went to them to ask the questions, but didn't give them the promotion. And the final point in this area is the use of self-regulatory strategies. Now, that could be in the entrepreneurship world. We have lots of things. We have people who wake up at 5 a.m. That's really not me. I do not do that. Who journal, who meditate. Brilliant people that do, but my self-regulatory strategy is not that. It is about to-do lists. And if you missed it, please do catch episode 80 with Georgina Fihosi, where she talks about her brilliant and beautiful stationery in her journey, Afro Touch Designs. So I do that. I do have a plan for the day. I do love a plan. I do use notebooks. So all those self-regulatory strategies, how do we do that to enable cognitive engagement and to get things done? And the final one, we go back to agency here, is agentic engagement, proactive, intentional, and constructive contribution to the flow of the learning activity. So this could be in the entrepreneurial space. How do we contribute? How do we be part of the bigger picture? You'll have heard the famous things around Simon Sinek and why. So why are we doing specific things? What's your why? And I guess I've got a couple of whys, really. One of my whys is I don't want people to suffer in the workplace. So if I can provide high quality, impactful training to managers to have conversations about mental ill health, race equality, we are going to have a lot more happy staff. I don't want people to suffer. I also think that people need to be given training to understand what they need to do. Everyone has different innate skills in terms of aptitude and enthusiasm. Although I am a really big fan of Matthew Said and the book Bounce, The Myth of Talent and the Power of Practice. So do check that out if you haven't read it. But I also think that certain people have natural aptitudes given the environment they worked in, given what their families might be like, etc. And my why is also that I don't want people to experience the kinds of racism and things that I have. Again, that could be very naive. We're in quite a difficult place globally. However, that's my why. So that proactive, intentional, and constructive contribution. I also know that I am one person with a perspective and an approach, and I'm not afraid of recommending my peers who do fantastic job and work as well. And then within an agentic engagement, enriching the learning activity rather than passively receiving it as a given. So if we go on training courses, if we do things to enhance our knowledge, how do we really engage in it? And how do we take on that learning, make it our own, and use it in our day to day? And so for me, this is, I've been able to do all of these things. So yes, I'm talking about learning, but for me, remember, one of the 5 ways of well-being is to keep learning, to stretch ourselves. And if we feel we have agency, and I definitely feel I have agency in terms of running my own business, and then we delve into it a bit more and think about the 4 domains of engagement that influence motivation and behavior, and one of them being agentic engagement, but we've also got cognitive engagement, emotional engagement, and behavioral engagement. That really helps us with our self-efficacy, with our well-being, with our mental health. And if you want to know more about my business journey and how I got here, do check out episode number 1 of the Diverse Minds podcast, which is all about diverse minds and my journey. Episode number 33, Jumping Over Hurdles with Andrea Rainsford. She has a phenomenal story around long-term physical ill health, mental ill health, long-term disability, and she runs a phenomenal business called SEO Angels. And episode 56, Creating Safe Cultural Spaces with Rupinder Kaur, who runs the Asian Women Mean Business and the Inspire Network. And I just want to say this is not about solving every single problem you have. That of course, there have been times that have been really challenging. Many of you will know at the beginning of lockdown, I didn't have any work really coming in April and May. I think part of it was luck, but part of it was the types of engagement that we've talked about. Rarely is anything in life a breeze, but when we have agency and work to our heart's content, we can, of course, move mountains, especially as global majority women. And I want to leave you with a quote from the wonderful Ella Jane Fitzgerald, who said, "Just don't give up trying to do what you really want to do. Where there's love and inspiration, I don't think you can go wrong." And there's not a truer word spoken. So I really hope you found this episode useful about agency, why it's so important, how entrepreneurship has really helped me, how we will encounter barriers, particularly as global majority women. Don't stop. Remember, you are the CEO of your own life, so who is on your board? And you've always got time to create a plan. So if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to know more about how my coaching can help you, please do check it out on diverseminds.co.uk/solutions/coaching. And those are in the show notes. And link to the resources, that Harvard Business Review article, Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. And I've also included a link to the paper, Agency as a Fourth Aspect of Students' Engagement During Learning Activities. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or anywhere that you can leave reviews. And I really hope you've enjoyed the show. And I'll see you next time for a fantastic episode with an amazing female entrepreneur talking about how she turned her hobby into a business. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.